This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Alpha Natural Resources, an energy company dedicated to respecting the land. Alpha Natural Resources, we power the world through the energy of our people. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, promoting the free enterprise system to enhance economic competitiveness. Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and a special welcome back to Jeff Shapiro, and a welcome to Bob Lewis. We're delighted to have the two of you here. Bob Lewis, Associated Press, Jeff Shapiro, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, two of the main ones in the declining number of people who cover the Capitol for the people of the Commonwealth. And we appreciate what you do, and look forward to your informing the viewers on some things that you've been writing about, that you've been considering, what's coming up in the 2013 session, which we're just a few weeks away before it convenes. And I'm holding a prop that we might refer to later, or I might if you haven't. But Jeff, start with you and then with Bob. And then as I tell other guests, and I especially tell the two of you, you may completely ignore me and just have conversation with each other, and I'll chime in as the time gets short.
Well, that prop, that printed copy of the Virginia budget will be an important prop going forward. Virginia writes a budget 2 years at a time, and at that midpoint makes revisions, and Governor McDonald will be submitting some changes, and the legislature will tweak with the budget as well. But a lot of this is taking place, or actually this will all be taking place in advance of what by Virginia standards is the main event, the election for governor. And all 100 seats in the House of Delegates, of course, are up. So depending on one's perspective, the elective class is at its best or worst when its name is about to appear on the ballot. So I don't think one can underestimate the importance of the approaching election in terms of the thinking, the conduct, the performance of the 2013 legislature.
I agree, David. And this document you're holding is going to be the seminal document for the entire session, because the most important things they want to do this year: healthcare, Medicaid, transportation, the transportation bill that the governor is going to outline at some point between now and the start of the session. That all has to go through there. It has to be funded. And right now, we don't know what the impact of the fiscal cliff, or whatever you want to call it, deficit reduction at the federal level, is going to be. We know there's going to be an impact. Even if we avoid the fiscal cliff, there's going to be a reduction in federal funding. And it all has to go through this document to get funded. And government speaks through what it funds.
And Bob, referring to the fiscal cliff, that spotlights a bigger issue, one the politicians choose not to talk about, and that is the, if you will, dependence, arguably over-dependence, Virginia has on federal largesse. Better than a quarter of the state's economy is attributed directly to federal spending, whether it's contracts to a big think tank somewhere outside of Washington along the Beltway, or a military base down in Hampton Roads. And there's this delightful paradox, if not contradiction, in Virginia politics that, it's an article of faith that politicians are critical of Washington and its irresponsibility with taxpayer money, but God forbid anyone should go after their share of the federal pie. And there is this bigger issue of what does Virginia do to somehow diversify its economy going forward. And there will be some issues before the Assembly that have to do with that. For example, this proposed uranium mine. It's been 30 plus years since this idea has been first floated. But now it appears the legislature is prepared to vote up or down on whether to lift this prohibition. And one of the things the proponents keep talking about is this is another way to diversify the Virginia economy, specifically the rural South Side economy, which never really recovered from the dramatic contraction in manufacturing.
And Jeff's got a very good point there. Put it another way, no state in the country is as dependent per capita on federal spending as Virginia. Military spending, we're number one per capita. California gets more actual dollars, but they got a lot more people. So Virginia's economy is going to feel what happens in Congress probably more than any other state. We're the backyard of Washington. Now, about uranium. That's going to be interesting because that's going to be one of the truest tests of money versus concern for public health that we've seen on the floors of the House and Senate and in the committees in some time. Every lobbyist on this Hill is almost moneyed up one side or another. It's an absolute. It's going to be a Super Bowl of powerful influences coming to bear on the uranium question this year. It's one to watch.
It will be. And going back to this document again, one of you, either of you, both of you, tell our viewers that does the legislature really need to adopt a budget? I mean, this has been adopted for the 2 years.
As a strict legal and constitutional issue, they don't have to do anything this year. We've got a 2-year budget. As a practical fiscal matter, they better, because that budget doesn't account for a drop-off in federal funding. Mm-hmm. That budget doesn't account for the changes that are going to have to be made as far as expanding Medicaid under new federal law. They've got to do something. Now, as we talked about before the show, we've gone without making amendments in the midterm of the 2-year budget cycle to the budget. Governor Gilmore, in his final year, decided, hey, we can live without it. He made the 15% reductions that the Constitution allows him to make on his own, and the legislature wasn't part of it. He paid a political price for that, and so did his party in the next election. But it's not absolutely necessary that you amend that budget.
However, Bob McDonnell, in his last full year as governor, and still shopping around for a legacy, is looking at that budget as a way to at least put one in place. Transportation, for example, it seems that the governor is opting yet again for a boldly cautious approach. He's not interested in raising taxes. It appears that he's going to be moving some money around. He talks about $500 million a year in fresh cash. He hasn't said where he's going to find that money, but at a minimum, he hopes to prevent the continuing bleed off of construction dollars to maintenance. Under Virginia law, this state has to preserve what it has before it adds to its highway network. The cost of maintenance is climbing. We're seeing about $365 million taken annually from the road building fund. Bob McDonnell is pledging to at least plug that hole. And there is a proposal coming over from the Senate side. John Watkins from Powhatan, kind of on the edges of Richmond, formerly of Chesterfield, is putting together a package that in effect would impose the sales tax on fuel prices. It's part of a bigger package to do something about a long-term financial fix for roads. But the House, where that anti-tax reflex is still very strong, is likely to spike that if it even gets that
particularly
far.
in an election year, with all 100 seats open. I think you're going to see more flirtation. He mentioned Senator Watkins' bill and how it would phase back in sales tax on gasoline. There's a flirtation with indexing either the gasoline tax or a sales tax on gasoline, some way that gasoline taxes can keep pace with cost fluctuations. Right now, with 17.5 cents a gallon on gas and declining gasoline usage, more efficient cars, we're losing money, not to mention the increased cost of asphalt, steel, concrete, and labor. So our ability to maintain roads is being chewed up by inflation and by a declining revenue source. And when we have to throw more money into maintenance, that's money we don't get to use for new construction. So our new construction budget is going to virtually disappear unless they find a way to fund maintenance, and that's what Governor McDonnell is trying to do.
Yeah, and cutting to the chase, indexing, that's a fancy way of saying automatic increases in the fuel tax. This is an idea that has been batted around for many years. In 1986, when the legislature last made a serious long-term investment in roads, Jerry Beliles was governor, there was a lot of talk then about weaving an index, that automatic trigger, into the fuel tax. Now, one of the considerations then was not just fiscal. Let's see that this tax continues to keep pace with need, but there's a political advantage too, because other than vote whatever number of times in public on possibly raising the fuel tax, the legislators can rely on their friend the index to do the dirty work for them. And of course, it's driven by the cycles of the economy. Now, in the case of the index as envisioned now, it would be tied to the cost of construction materials, which is somewhat different than the indexes that are in effect in other states.
We rarely, as voters in Virginia, get a chance to vote on issues. We vote for the officials who get elected. I can recall just a few times in my relatively short history around the Capitol and as a Virginian where I've voted. Any speculation that an issue such as transportation tax increase might be on the ballot in November?
Well, our Constitution, unless they make it a constitutional amendment, our Constitution does not allow for government by referendum. Yes, we've had questions on the ballot before. It comes to mind that we had the taxing authorities in Hampton Roads in Northern Virginia, in 2002, was rejected roundly by voters.
The turnout or the opposition was even stronger in Hampton Roads than it was in Northern Virginia.
Right, but we don't allow for direct referendum government here. Politicians do that as sort of an expedient to say, oh, well, look, I'm just doing the voters' bidding, and that way they don't have to take direct accountability upon themselves. They are advisory at best, but do they throw it out there and say, here, give us some political cover through this referendum? I don't know. Maybe they will. I doubt it. I think they've pretty much learned their lesson on that.
Now, healthcare has a cost. What it is, we don't know yet. And of course, these would be changes that Virginia must make to comply with President Obama's health care reform initiative, the one that was affirmed by the Supreme Court. Now, the governor and the Speaker of the House, Bill Howell, a Republican, made a political calculation earlier this year. They said, we're not going to do anything about this because we're going to gamble that Barack Obama is going to be defeated and the Republicans are going to take back the U.S. Senate, and then all of this will become history. Well, of course, the president was reelected. He carried Virginia again. If there's evidence that, or some evidence that his victory in 2008 was not a fluke, it would seem to be his victory here in 12. And now it's time to do something. Governor McDonnell has expressed hostility to a vast expansion of the Medicaid program, and any kind of network or infrastructure, he's not exactly clear on what he'd like to do. He's only asking the federal government for more time to do it, and the clock is ticking. All of this has got to be in place by 2014, of course, after he leaves office.
It was a pretty bold gamble, and it wound up not working well for them at all. And they're going to be scurrying, and they already are scurrying, and particularly after January 9th, when all 140 come back to this lovely capital and start their work again.
Yeah, no, they have taken some baby steps, but they really are of little consequence. There's a lot to put in place, and there are a lot of people involved in this. Legislators, the governor, the healthcare industry. We're talking about an industry that is probably, third or fourth largest part of the economy here. So this is not something that is going to be put in place easily. But it's something that Bob McDonnell has to take care of before he leaves office.
Now, as far as expanding Medicaid to cover others, that too an issue before the General Assembly this year, or does that get moved on down to a later session, whether to expand the number of the options that the Supreme Court left to the states as far as expanding Medicaid?
Well, that was the point, of course, on which the court's decision seemed to kind of confuse and puzzle people. But remember, this is a state that, despite its considerable wealth, I mean, the 12th largest state in the country, it is among the most parsimonious when it comes to looking after those less fortunate than ourselves. We're on Medicaid reimbursements. I think we're under 70 cents on the dollar now.
We're among the cheapest in the country.
And I think we're at about 46th or 47th among the states. There are some states among the reddest states, where Mississippi, for example, where expansion of Medicaid makes great sense because they're already getting a lot of money from the federal government, and they're going to be getting more. But it's not clear how much more this state would have to commit to any kind of expansion, or what it could expect in terms of assistance from the federal government.
Education, is that an issue that will make any kind of a splash? Higher ed or public education, charter schools, have you seen anything, written anything about any of those issues coming up in 13 session?
Well, the governor is promising an education package that I don't know if it'll be embedded in the budget he presents Monday to the General Assembly. He'll obviously have to put some of it in the budget. And I don't know exactly what he intends to do. I think he's going to go for some teacher accountability language that you can expect vigorous opposition from the Virginia Education Association, and some strenuous support from School Boards Association and from the Republicans. As far as how much actual money is going to be put into there, I don't think much, because I don't think they have much to play with.
Teacher accountability, it boils down to one word: tenure, which is a fancy way of saying job protection. Yeah. And the VEA, the teachers union, is very concerned about this, and of course there is a political dynamic here. The VEA tends to be very supportive of Democrats, though it's certainly supported a share of Republicans over the years. And so this becomes a DV versus R struggle. We got a taste of it a bit last year. The governor would also like to do more in the way of charter schools, the idea of having these kind of freestanding public schools, independent and unregulated, if you will, by their school boards. He'd like to see more of that as well. Of course, a lot of this all comes down to money, and local governments are howling. There's a lot of pressure on their budgets. Not every jurisdiction is like Fairfax, where most of the money that goes into the system is, coming out of local residents' pockets. So there's always that struggle between local government and the state in terms of what the former can expect from the latter on teacher salaries and that sort of thing. As far as higher education is concerned, there was a big initiative a year back, but one of the things that higher education had to pledge to do in return for more money from the state was help produce more degrees. In other words, they needed to take in more students. And all of this is going on at a time when, the best universities, the best public universities in the state in particular, are receiving fewer and fewer dollars in terms of direct appropriation from the state.
And in every state, you're seeing this trend. They go for out-of-state students. They tend to increase the ratio of out-of-state students who pay not only their full ride, but 1/3 of somebody else's. And sometimes it skews enrollment heavily toward out-of-state kids. And I've heard that complaint from people who have tried to get children into UVA, Virginia Tech, James Madison, William & Mary. I don't think we're ever going to go back to the good old days of lush state support that we saw in the 1980s and 1990s. And so that's why you're seeing private endowments cover more of the cost of state universities. But I agree with Jeff on that.
In our last couple of minutes, what other issue would you want to mention? Is it in public safety? Is it environment? What is something you said, I thought David was going to ask me about this, and David hasn't. So Jeff, Bob, what other issue would you want to tell our viewers about?
Well, something that is sort of, your inside story. We went through this a bit last year with the public employee retirement system. Now we have the public employee health insurance fund, which is going to have to be pumped up. And so that's a problem that the governor is going to have to address. There are always those great business battles. It looks like the corporations and the trial lawyers are going to go at it again over some streamlining in the tort process that would make it easier for big business, it believes, to get some favorable judgments out of the courts on personal injury cases and that sort of thing.
I want to see how they dispense with the personhood bill that got so much attention last year. I think it's going to be shuttled over to a committee to be dispensed with early on. And what's the reaction to that? I don't think we're going to see the sort of dramatics that we saw last year in the protests over ultrasound and personhood. Maybe the Republicans have learned their lesson, and that they don't want that sort of a spectacle going into a House election year. Also, I want to see what happens with the tolls on 95.
Yes.
Yeah, the governor has a chance to solve that problem in his budget. Whether he does or not, I don't know. But there was a meeting last night in Sussex. I think there's another one tonight. There's a lot of organized opposition to people who, with some justification, feel like it's unfair. It does put a burden on one of the poorest parts of the state. And how much political clout do they have? We'll find out in about 3 weeks.
It's interesting to think about some of those same areas of the state, because in the last session of the General Assembly, in fact, worked out in language in this budget, it somewhat limits, in a way, the number of tickets that they can write on the interstate and get those funds flowing to the locality. Right. There's a formula, and so if they go beyond a certain number of tickets, a certain amount of money, then it flows to the state police instead of to the localities. Yeah. Some of those same localities.
I think that originated from allegations there was a speed trap in Prince George County on 295, and that one got sort of loud and nasty last year. I think Senator Watkins had a bill to
yes.
clamp down on that.
Len's new meaning to pay as you go.
Yeah.
Right.
Talk about a
Pay-
user fee, yeah.
Pay as you go. Well, thank you both very much for being on This Week in Richmond and informing our viewers. And our viewers, when you hear about the budget this coming session, or when you're reading Associated Press as it comes out, and you
Please
see the name
do,
of
yes.
Bob Lewis, Richmond Times-Dispatch, or on your blog or on TV or wherever Jeff Shapiro's found. But thank you both very much for being
Love
on This
your
Week in
snowman
Richmond.
tie.
Thank
the
you.
holiday season, holiday spirit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Alpha Natural Resources, an energy company dedicated to respecting the land. Alpha Natural Resources, we power the world through the energy of our people. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, promoting the free enterprise system to enhance economic competitiveness. Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.